Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical insights and facts. And let me first apologize for being absent these past 2 weeks, but I'm afraid my week was very hectic those past 2 weeks and I didn't have time to record. And when I did record the first time, for some reason, my system just closed me out completely whenever I'd start a new file. But however, I'm back. Don't worry, I am alive. And I figured that since yesterday was July the 4th, America's Independence Day, America's birthday, woo! USA! 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 Sorry, I had to get that out of my system. Anyway, as yesterday was Independence Day, I figured today's podcast would be about going over the history of the 4th of July celebrations and traditions that have become associated with the 4th of July. I figured the best way to do this would be to give some history first of the Revolutionary War. The earliest Revolutionary War battles broke out in April of 1775. However, not many people wanted complete independence from England. Those who did were considered radicals. However, toward the middle of the following year, more and more people came to favor independence, thanks to mounting hostilities against the British. And on June 7th, 1776, Continental Congress met at Independence Hall, or as it was then called, the Pennsylvania State House, where Richard Henry Lee brought forth a proposal for America to gain its independence from England. And amid a heated debate, Congress voted to postpone the vote on Lee's proposal, but appointed a 5-man committee to draft a formal statement justifying the break with England. The 5 men were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and on July 2nd, 1776, Continental Congress voted in favor of Lee's proposal to annex the United States, or the colonies at that time, from England. And 2 days later, on July the 4th, 1776, Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. And although the vote was actually decided on July the 2nd, July the 4th became known as Independence Day because that was the day Declaration of Independence was officially adopted. Although this date was not always met with agreement. For example, John Adams believed that the July the 2nd should really be Independence Day, and throughout his life would regularly turn down invitations to appear at July the 4th events. Ironically, however, he, along with Thomas Jefferson, died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. In the years before America was declared an independent nation, colonists held annual celebration of the King's birthday, which traditionally included the ringing of bells, bonfires, processions, and speeches. However, during the summer of 1776, some colonists celebrated the birth of our nation by holding mock funerals for King George III. Festivities during the summer of 1776 included the firing of cannons, muskets, bonfires, and public readings of the Declaration of Independence. And let's not forget food. Strange though it may seem, the first 4th of July meal ever eaten contained turtle soup. On July 4th, 1776, John Adams and his wife Abigail, to celebrate the founding of the new nation, sat to a feast of turtle soup, poached salmon with egg sauce, green peas, boiled potatoes, and a dessert of either Indian pudding or apple pandowdy. And it should also be noted that John Adams more or less predicted modern 4th of July celebrations. In a letter to his wife Abigail, John Adams wrote that Independence Day would be celebrated by pomp and parade, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. But let's not forget, a war was still going on at this time, and to celebrate the anniversary of independence in 1778 and 1781, George Washington issued double rations of rum to all his men to mark the anniversary of independence during those respective years. And the tradition of setting off fireworks on the 4th of July began 1 year after the Declaration was adopted on July the 4th, 1777, during the first organized celebration of Independence Day. Ship's cannons also fired a 13-gun salute in honor of the 13 colonies. And some other traditions began not too long after that. Beginning in the early 1800s, reports of barbecuing being held to honor the occasion were reported in the South. In 1808, the local newspaper of Pendleton, South Carolina, Miller's Weekly Messenger, reported that a July 4th parade parade was immediately followed by a communal barbecue. And Independence Day barbecues became a solid tradition during the early 1820s. Celebrations would usually begin with a parade led by members of the National Guard, and then citizens comprised the bulk of the crowd, and they would all march to either the local courthouse or the church, where an elaborate ceremony would commence. And later, of course, these traditions would eventually head westward, specifically to the city of Kansas City, Missouri, which would later popularize its own form of barbecue, which, in my humble opinion, is probably the best form of barbecue there is. Fight me on this. This is a hill on which I will die. And the patriotic tradition of celebrating our country's independence became even more widespread after the War of 1812, when once again our country faced against the great oppressor, Great Britain, or as I like to call it, the number one cause of national independence. And in fact, independence from England seems to be a holiday that is celebrated the most. Yes, it is over different days, but 65 countries in total all celebrate their independence from England. Sorry, got off on a little tangent right there for a second. However, in 1781, Massachusetts became the first state to recognize July 4th as a state holiday. However, July the 4th would not become a national holiday until the 1870s. Now back on to the subject of the 4th of July meal. It may surprise some of you to know, as I said about barbecue, that for the longest time, the traditional 4th of July feast would include turtle soup in honor of John and Abigail Adams. However, as certain turtle species began to decline, mock turtle soup came into popularity. And then people began roasting whole pigs, a type of barbecue which has now relatively faded into obscurity. And to continue with another iconic symbol of the 4th of July, it may surprise some of you to know that the Star-Spangled Banner, although written in 1814, did not become our country's national anthem until 1931. Prior to that, it had been dropped by Congress 6 times because the tune of the Star-Spangled Banner is taken from an old English drinking song. And it should be noted that although July the 4th had been a federal holiday since 1870, it would not become a federal paid holiday until 1941. And I think we should all thank the Founding Fathers for the great sacrifice they made. Had they been discovered, we may not only still be a British Dominion, the Founding Fathers would most likely have been tortured and killed had they been discovered. And now time for some statistics. Did you know that Americans typically consume 7 billion hot dogs from Memorial Day to Labor Day? And that's around 818 hot dogs consumed every second during that period. And 10% of annual retail hot dog sales occurred during July, which of course is National Hot Dog Month. And residents of Los Angeles, California consume the most hot dogs of any other city, around 30 million pounds. It should also be noted that some founding fathers died on July the 4th. Besides Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, James Monroe also bit the dust on July the 4th. As I said before, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826. James Monroe died on July the 4th, 1831. However, only one president was born on July 4th, and that was Calvin Coolidge. And it should also be noted that without the Declaration of Independence, there'd be no July the 4th, no Independence Day. And I've always found it sad that it's often the most overlooked of all our historic documents. But without the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution don't amount to much. And this was definitely understood by one of our nation's greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln. And while running for the Senate in 1858, Lincoln gave one of the best descriptions of the Declaration of Independence I think I've ever heard. Though I wasn't there in person, of course. I mean, I've just read it myself, but you know what I mean. Anyway, on a more serious note, while running for the Senate, Lincoln gave this speech in regards to the Declaration of Independence. This was their majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe. This was their lofty, wise, and noble understanding of the justice of the Creator to his creatures. Yes, gentlemen, to all his creatures, to the whole great family of man. In their enlightened belief, nothing stamped with the divine image and likeness was sent into the world to be trodden on, and degraded, and imbruted by its fellows. They grasped not only the whole race of man then living, but they reached forward and seized upon the farthest posterity. They erected a beacon to guide their children and their children's children and the countless myriads who should inhabit the earth in other ages. Wise statesmen as they were, They knew the tendency of prosperity to breed tyrants, and so they established these great self-evident truths that when in the distant future some man, some faction, some interest should set up the doctrine that none but rich men or none but white men were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, their posterity might look up again to the Declaration of Independence, take courage to renew the battle which their fathers began, so that truth, justice, mercy, and all the humane and Christian virtues might not be extinguished from the land, so that no man would hereafter dare to limit and circumscribe the great principles on which the Temple of Liberty was being built. That's about as good of a description as I've ever heard of the Declaration of Independence. That in mind, close this week's podcast with these words: goodbye, and God bless you all.